Once again, the streets of our country were taken over today by people who don't belong here. America's illegal aliens are becoming ever bolder. March through our streets and demand your rights. Excuse me, you have no rights here. At some point, this could all turn very violent, as Americans become fed up with the failure of their government to address the most pressing domestic issue of our time.
The reality is that America is changing. By the end of this century, a majority of the people living in the United States will trace their origins not to Europe, but to Latin America. That's an enormous transformation in the actual composition of the nation. And unless we all understand how that happened, we will not be able to deal with the inevitable conflicts that come from ignorance between racial and ethnic groups in the America of the 21st century. As a journalist, since I'd covered Latino communities across the country now for more than 30 years, and interviewed its leaders and had a sense of how those communities had been built, I felt that I should at least try to chronicle the story, because the reality is that there's a reason why there are so many Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Salvadorans in the United States, because really the major migrations come precisely from those countries that the United States once dominated and even occupied. They never teach us in school that the huge Latino presence here is a direct result of our own government's actions in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America over many decades. Actions that forced millions from that region to leave their homeland and journey north. My father was born in Puerto Rico, in a family that was thrust into deep poverty and hunger during the Great Depression. My grandmother basically had to give her children away to neighbors and friends so that they could feed them. My father went through terrible experiences. He came out of that a sullen, alcoholic, sometimes violent man. Through understanding the enormous pain that he went through in his life, I was able to get a better understanding of who I was here in the United States.
Strange case of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was taken as a prize of war, Spanish-American War of 1898, along with Cuba and the Philippines. Cuba and the Philippines were gradually released by the United States. Puerto Rico was not. When the United States took over Puerto Rico, so did 4 North American sugar companies. That's what it was all about, sugar.
Puerto Rico almost flew apart because of the selfish sugar landowners. They owned tremendous tracts of land in Puerto Rico, which they devoted entirely to sugar, then worked these poor people for $1 a day or 50 cents if they could get them for that, and they'd rather see those people starve. I don't mean to imply that we were in any way cruel to the Puerto Ricans, but there is another kind of cruelty. That's indifference and neglect.
In 1917, the United States imposed citizenship on Puerto Rico, U.S. citizenship, just in time to draft 20,000 Puerto Ricans and send them to fight in World War I. At the time, the people of Puerto Rico did not even vote for their own governor. The official language of the courts in Puerto Rico was English. The official language of the schools in Puerto Rico was English. My father remembers in the 1930s as a child being punished for speaking Spanish in school in Puerto Rico.
The situation changed from one of welcoming the Americans to, within a few years, a very strong anti-American movement that developed throughout the island. Not until Harry Truman became president did the White House finally begin to address the problems of Puerto Rico.
The world was looking over our shoulder. We had to make good on our promises to the underprivileged people whom we had proposed to protect by going into the Spanish-American War. So I had to sit there and either let Puerto Rico go to hell or I had to do something about it.
Both the Puerto Rican government and the U.S. government saw migration as essentially a safety valve. Thousands upon thousands of Puerto Ricans were actually recruited, signed up on the island to come work here in the United States. My parents came to the United States right after World War II in 1946. My father and his two brothers had both fought in World War II. They didn't speak a word of English when they went into the Army, but they figured now that they'd fought for America and they'd fought for democracy, and given the enormous economic problems in Puerto Rico, that they'd come here for opportunity.
There's an ongoing debate. Are Puerto Ricans immigrants? And I asked my father this question. He thundered at me. I was an immigrant. I came to this country in a boat. I didn't speak English.
Cruz Rivera, the sixth of 17 children from Juan and Tomaso Rivera, decided to come to New York to make his fortune. Came literally on the banana boat, on the freighters they used to ship produce from Central America and the Caribbean to the United States. He arrived in a city that was riven with racism and discrimination. He got a job on 42nd Street and 6th Avenue in a cafeteria. That's where he met my mother. They fell in love and married.
My parents left Puerto Rico because of money. They were in search of the American dream. My father was the last of 13 kids growing up in a very small sugarcane part of Puerto Rico. He came for a job. He came, he landed in February, right before the end of the Second World War. 2 days later, he got a job at the Warwick Hotel, and he stayed working there for 39 years.
My dad just wanted us to be the Puerto Rican Ozzie and Harriet. He wanted us to fit in. He started using the name Al instead of Cruz. He wanted very much for us to be just like every one of our neighbors.
He started out first as a houseman, and then after 30-some-odd years, he wanted a promotion to become a waiter. They told him initially that he couldn't become a waiter because his English wasn't good enough. All of the waiters at the hotel at the time, they all had broken English, except they were Germans, or they were Greeks, or they were Italians. There were no Latino waiters at the time. And my dad filed a union grievance to become a waiter. He wanted to become a banquet waiter. He always would make the joke anyway. They didn't matter how good your English was, because when you're a banquet waiter, everybody gets the same thing. Everybody gets chicken.
There were definitely positive benefits from the U.S. relationship with Puerto Rico that helped industrialize the island, built roads and infrastructure, and provided jobs that didn't exist. But it came at an enormous price. My anger in delving into this history is tempered by a conviction I've always had that the American people still cling to the basic sense of fairness. Once they have accurate facts, they rarely allow injustices to stand.
If you had to pick one date where U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America went wrong, the date would be 1954 and the place Guatemala. That was the beginning of this terrible, terrible attitude that the United States developed towards Latin America, and particularly towards Central America, where change became our enemy.
Guatemala fue tremendo. 200,000 muertos que hemos contabilizado, más de 50,000 desaparecidos, 83% de los desaparecidos y los ejecutados fueron mayas. O sea, el dolor es demasiado fuerte que nuestro pueblo nunca lo va a olvidar.
Guatemala was one of the few countries in Latin America that after World War II actually experienced a period of democratic rule. President Jacobo Arbenz was determined to reduce widespread poverty by effecting major land reform in Guatemala. Only 2% of the owners controlled 75% of the arable land, and of all those, the United Fruit Company was the largest, with some 600,000 acres of property. It was such a powerhouse, owning its own railroads, its own shipping lines. It really was more powerful than any government throughout most of the 20th century. In fact, Latin America became the incubator for all the great American multinational companies. Two of the key principals in the U.S. government, John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under President Eisenhower, his brother, Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, had both been law partners in the main law firm that represented United Fruit Company.
The feeling was we could very easily overthrow this progressive government and make it a lot easier for the United Fruit Company and other American businesses to operate in Central America.
The CIA got heavily involved in managing public opinion. It created the image of Arbenz as a crazy radical. And it was a systematic effort, mobilization and financing of opposition forces until the Arbenz government was overthrown. A vicious repression of all progressives and supporters of the Arbenz government ensued. Guatemala really began to establish a new pattern whereby the United States government used covert operations, employed local proxies to destabilize and overthrow governments in the region.
It's a great day for the liberation leader as the populace demonstrates its joy at being rescued from the tyranny that prevailed during the communist regime of ousted President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. The end of the Civil War, and more important, the end of another attempt by the Kremlin to get a foothold in the New World.
After the overthrow, you have the beginnings of a civil war. People were picked up on the streets in the middle of the night, kidnapped, assassinated. You had the growth of a guerrilla war and of the government's efforts at counterinsurgency. As the rebels retreated into the countryside, they built up very big support among the Mayan and Canjobal people who had always been discriminated against by the Guatemalan government. The Civil War really went from about the 1960s to the 1980s, And as it escalated, the government responded with resettlement campaigns and a genocidal war against the Indians.
Yo salí de Guatemala después del que quemaron vivo mi padre en la Embajada de España. Pedían asilo político al gobierno español. Y con el propósito de salvar sus vidas, entraron en la embajada. Y en ese momento las fuerzas de seguridad de Guatemala atacaron la embajada. Los quemaron vivos, a todos. Realmente ningún sobreviviente de los campesinos, de los estudiantes, de la gente que estaba allí. En Guatemala, si lo que hay es persecución, es asesinato, es matanza, lo que hay es inseguridad en la vida. Yo prefiero romper la frontera e ir donde sentiré más seguridad.
Los estadounidenses no tienen idea de por qué uno se viene a los Estados Unidos. No la tienen. Y si la tienen, yo creo que la tienen equivocada. Y fue bien difícil dejarla. Fue duro. Tenía 4 años, mira. Ni siquiera entendía que su mamá se iba a venir y no iba a estar mañana ahí, cuando ella se levantara. Dejar tus hijos, eso no es fácil. Venir aquí, el precio que pagas es carísimo. No tiene precio. No tiene precio.
I was almost 7 years old when I came to LA to be reunited with my mother because she left Guatemala 3 or 4 years before I did. It was a very long trip. It was by bus, it was by car, by walking many, many miles. Going through the southern part of Mexico is one of the toughest parts. When it came to crossing the border, I had to say that the coyote was my father and that my grandmother was my mother. And we were coming to visit. The immigration officer asked me, like, what's your mom's name? And I said, Aura. He asked me for my father's name, and I forgot. I forgot his name. Luckily, we were not sent back to Guatemala. We were not able to cross to the U.S. that first time because of my fault. But my grandmother is a person with a lot of persistence and a lot of tenacity, and she's like, no, we're going to try again. In January 27, 1991, I came to LA. All I remember is seeing this really big pregnant woman running down the stairs, and I was worried that she was going to fall off the stairs. And she lifted me up, and she carried me, and she was kissing me a lot. It was definitely very emotional. I think to some extent I did feel like a stranger. Like I think that, I'm like, why is this woman hugging me so hard? And I was happy, but I was also, I think, to some extent confused of what's really going on. I think about that often, and I think that my children hopefully will be the first ones that there won't be a separation, you know, that I will be able to have my children and won't need to migrate, you know, to survive. Grandma did come undocumented, and then my mom came undocumented. I also came undocumented, and it took us over close to 20 years to be able to fix our status.
Cuando tú estás en Guatemala y tú piensas venirte para acá, tu plan no es quedarte, no. Pero cuando vienes aquí es otra historia. Y es más difícil cuando sos ilegal. Mucho más difícil.
Oh, I feel a breeze. You feel it?
Es amazing, es increíble para mí porque cuando yo vivía en Guatemala, yo no tenía ni idea de que existía Harvard.
She's like, no, I'm holding it. This is my diploma from Harvard University. Yeah, I can believe it's my name in it.
Mariana Zamboni.
I think that my mom was given the opportunities to have achieved her educational dreams. She would have gone to Harvard. I believe she's a fighter.
Listen, I'm for pretty open immigration, but when the immigrants come, they come with a culture of criminality. It's out of control.
They put a strain on our Social Security, our education, our health care.
American history is replete with upsurges of anti-immigrant fervor. Immigration has always been a big battleground because there's always an attempt of those who came a while ago to then paint those who came more recently as the problem. The greatest danger we have is ignorance, because when people act out of ignorance, they usually act in ways that they come to regret later on.
Any summer since 1994, when this wall was put up, more people died those summers than the entire history of the Berlin Wall. Marco Antonio Villaseñor, the 5-year-old boy that dies with 18 men. Lucrecia Dominguez, the woman that dies in the arms of Jesus, her 15-year-old son. Anastasio Hernandez, stomped and tasered to death by the Border Patrol and Customs in 2010. People don't want to hear these stories, but these are stories that people need to hear. People do not want to leave their homeland. They don't want to leave their culture, their families, their language, what they're used to. Why would you want to pick up and leave like this?
We've been putting water in the desert since 1996, from San Diego all the way to Brownsville. We have to do it because every day 2 people die crossing the desert.
So we see this tragedy. Well, there's more people dying actually in Arizona. There's people dying in New Mexico, in Texas. It's absolutely wrong.
Of course, you really can't tell the story of Latinos in America without dealing with the Mexican population, because Mexicans are by far the largest group of the Latino population in the United States. Most people are not aware that since 1820, when the United States first started gathering immigration statistics, there has been no nation in the world that has sent more people to the United States than Mexico. And we're talking about legal immigration. More legal Mexican immigrants have come to this country since 1820 than the Irish, than the Germans, than the French, than any other population. The reality is that great swaths of the United States and the West were originally part of Mexico. California, Nevada, parts of Utah, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. That was all the northern territory of Mexico, and there were Mexican citizens living on that land before it became part of the United States. As they say in South Texas or in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, we didn't cross the border crossed us.
Mexico was quite aware that the U.S. was coming and that they were willing to expand themselves everywhere possible, especially in those areas of North America that formerly belonged to Spain, then to Mexico, but were empty, almost empty. It was a very tempting piece of land there. Mexico City said, well, we cannot really defend the northern part of our new republic unless we have a demographic push there. But we don't have enough people in Mexico to fill that empty space. Why don't invite foreigners? Why don't invite Catholic foreigners? The Irish that were already coming to the U.S. Let us receive them with open arms. But at the end, they were not Irish, they were not Catholic, and they brought the slaves.
Most of the settlers who moved into Texas came from the southern states. Many of them were slave owners themselves. So they naturally saw Texas as an area for expansion of slavery in America. But as more Americans moved into Texas, they suddenly began confronting the reality that the Mexican government had abolished slavery. The admission of Texas and then the Mexican-American War that followed is really a war to expand slavery in America. It was a short but vicious war. Once General Scott captures Mexico City and other U.S. troops occupy California, New Mexico, and the other northern territories of Mexico, the big question arises, how much of this territory is the United States going to keep?
Why did they decided to go back? The possibilities of contamination, physical as well as cultural contamination, could be a real danger for the U.S. So let us move out of Mexico. Let us move out of the territory in which we can find Mexicans. We don't want a Mexico with Mexicans.
Eventually, Congress decides to absorb as much territory as possible with the fewest people, but that leaves few hands to mine the resources. From the very beginning, the West depended for its labor on Mexicans. So that our wealth and prosperity here is not only due to the labor of the original settlers, but is also due to those Americans who were conquered. Then comes the Depression, unemployment skyrockets, a furor arises over competition by Mexican labor for jobs, and the Hoover administration initiates a massive deportation program. As many as 1 million Mexicans were just loaded onto trains and shipped out of the country. Some estimates are that as many as 60% of those deported were actually American citizens. There's been a pattern now for the last 100 years of Mexicans being recruited into the country and then shipped back out of the country. Recruited into the country, shipped back out of the country. The reality is that it's two countries, but one economy. The Mexicans function as a reserve labor force in good times in America and as an expendable labor force in the bad times.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
During World War II, you couldn't get any more immigrants from Europe, and the United States economy to fight the war was growing. The government was forced with two choices: bring African Americans up from the South and bring Mexicans and Puerto Ricans up from Latin America.
In Spanish, braceros means a man who works with arms and hands. But in American lingo, they are called lifesavers.
During World War II, the bracero program is initiated as a means of guaranteeing the steady flow of labor.
The important thing in those days was, how many hands do you have? ¿Cuántas manos tiene? The more hands you had, the more cotton you could pick. So education for Latinos was not that important. At age 10, I began my first formal schooling. A school that was called Schumannsville Mexican School. We had one room, one teacher, 8 grades. I felt that the majority of society wanted to keep you down, that you were a migrant, you should be in your place. Two days after my 17th birthday, I was sent to the South Pacific. The Marine Corps changed my life. It taught me a great deal about hard work. It taught me a great deal about values. I've always felt that proud feeling of being a Marine. After coming back, we felt that we fought for the United States. So we are just as good as any person. I took a GED and I passed it, and I went on to college when I was recalled back to Korea. Landed in Busan, Korea on my 24th birthday. We were not only fighting the enemy, but we were fighting the bitter cold. One of my men in my platoon got wounded, got shot in the head, delirious. I carried him up the hill. I got trapped on my knee and my hand. I kept on going. I came back from Korea and I got a job teaching one of the poor school districts in Texas. And I had 44 students, all Latinos. I still run into so many students, and some would say to me, if it had not been for you, I would have never finished high school. I always wear in my lapel an American flag because I am so proud to have served this country, and my parents were very proud that I served this country. We had 4 brothers that went to service during World War II. They say, to whom much is given, much is expected.
Several 100,000 Mexicans and Puerto Ricans served in World War II. And interestingly, much of the civil rights ferment in the Latino community came after the war from those veterans.
Dr. King convened us. We can talk about what the farm workers meant and how they fed the country. Because we who in the South grew up picking cotton and chopping tobacco didn't know those who were picking tomatoes and picking lettuce and picking grapes. We didn't know we were being picked on in different fields and different languages. When we were fighting for voting rights, that we sit in the same office together. We were fighting for equal protection, that we sit. We fight for affirmative action, that we sit. We fight for our share board seats, that we sit. So on all issues around equal opportunity and equal protection under the law and civil rights and social justice, that we end up together.
Well, wait for the history. The history will state what we are.
I came from Cuba when I was 10 years old on a freedom flight in October of 1969. Inside my heart, I was broken. I had been separated from everything I loved. The place that I loved and the people that I loved. The Cubans are, for the most part, political refugees. And even when you cite all of these economic reasons why they're here, behind it, when you really dig deep, is a political reason. The U.S. and Cuba have had this history. And all of the immigration has to do with that history and the role that the United States has played in Cuban affairs.
Navy warships are a common sight in Havana Harbor. The treaty ending the Spanish-American War has given the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to protect American investment on the island. A favorite port of call, our young sailors call friendly Havana a good liberty town.
The United States would occupy particular countries, basically rewrite the laws, train a new military, and then groom local dictators who, in essence, carry out American policy and turn over their countries for exploitation. Cuba was independent, but it was independent under the tutelage and control of the United States. Fulgencio Batista was the most powerful figure throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and through most of that period functioned as a virtual dictator, always supporting and facilitating additional penetration of the Cuban market by American companies. There's no doubt that the level of repression of the Batista regime sparked widespread discontent among the population and united all of the people to overthrow his rule.
Yo creo que los días más felices de mi vida fueron precisamente los de la caída de Batista. La idea de que llegaba la libertad a Cuba y que todos íbamos a participar en la construcción de un país. Pero a las pocas semanas A mí me repugnaba el espectáculo de los fusilamientos y de los juicios. Aquellos juicios que eran unos verdaderos circos.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
Los estudiantes y los campesinos empezaron un proceso de rebelión contra la nueva dictadura. Había una persona infiltrada en el grupo que le comunicó a la policía política lo que estábamos haciendo. Nos condenaron a 20 años de cárcel y como yo era menor de edad, pues me trasladaron a una cárcel de menor rigor hasta que cumpliera los 18 años. Y de esa cárcel me pude escapar. Lo recuerdo como si fuera hoy, y esto hace 50 años. Yo estaba seguro de que regresaríamos antes de 2 años. La emoción más fuerte que yo sentía era el compromiso con los estudiantes presos, con mis compañeros que habían quedado en la cárcel.
In 1961, Castro's army defeated an invasion of 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA. The Bay of Pigs became an embarrassment for the United States and served to increase Castro's popularity on the island and around the world.
Fue un terrible error del gobierno de los Estados Unidos lanzar una invasión a la que no estaban dispuestos a respaldar.
The vanguard of an estimated 50,000 refugees from Castro's Cuba arrives in Florida.
The first Cuban refugees were largely from the upper and middle classes. Castro instituted major health and education reforms for the poor, but some 215,000 exiles had left the island by 1962.
The end result was what the strategy has always been, to get rid of the enemy. And so a new wave of refugees comes, which leaves Cuba without the opposition. The sadness of this exile that wasn't temporary, like my father believed, became sort of an exciting new life at some point. I put all of my heart into learning English, into fully, being part of this new place. I was in love with this new life and with this country, and I felt like I was an Americanita. '80, I think, is the year that defined Miami. It basically convulsed the city when 10,000 Cubans stormed the Peruvian embassy seeking exile, and then ended up being part of the flotilla that brought 125,000 Cubans to Miami in 5 months. Talk about social upheaval. That was it. You could see, for example, the line of boats going down to Key West, because Fidel Castro had said, you can leave if you want to, and Jimmy Carter had said, we welcome you with open arms. And then, as the Marielitos were mistreated, and as all of this anger over bilingualism was taking place, I was really coming to terms with the fact that no matter how hard I tried, I wouldn't be, like, Tom Wolfe would say, an American in full. And I do believe that my experience was replicated by many Cubans, and I think that is why we built a different Miami.
Before the Cubans arrived, Miami was a sleepy resort town. The enormous renaissance of Miami and the growth of its trade and its commerce is really due in large part to the sacrifice and work of the Cuban population and then other Latinos who came after as the Cubans paved the way to develop Miami into the largely Latino city it is today.
want the folks across the United States to know that we're standing with them to protect American lives, liberty, and property from the invasion of the illegal aliens.
But Arizona's taking measures into its own hands. The state Senate has passed a tough new immigration law that will force police to arrest people who can't prove they're in the country legally. Now, critics say that would lead to racial profiling. Well, so what?
The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
I'm here because the United States invaded my country in 1965. An illegal invasion, completely trumped up excuse to invade the Dominican Republic and crush our democratic hopes. We've lived the consequences of that illegal invasion politically, economically, and in the bodies of the people who were wounded, in the bodies of the people who were killed. We've been living it for over 40 years.
There have been two major U.S. occupations of the Dominican Republic. The first was in 1916. The U.S. Army trained a new Dominican National Guard. It handpicked a former railway security officer, Rafael Trujillo, to lead that guard. And Trujillo then uses the power of the military to seize control of the government.
He was like the most horrific imagination of this terrifying dictator. He would disappear Dominican and American citizens and kill them with impunity.
He basically ruled the Dominican Republic for 30 years with absolute, total control. He routinely kidnapped and assaulted the wives, even of his supporters. And throughout his career, made it extremely easy for American companies to do business in the Dominican Republic, but was a savage dictator. Eventually, even the United States government could not stomach his methods of operation, so the CIA joined with disgruntled military officers to back his assassination.
For the first time in 30 years, the people of the Dominican Republic are breathing the sweet air of liberty, and the streets are jammed in celebration.
Mataron al chivo en la carretera, mataron al chivo en la carretera. Déjenmelo ver, déjenmelo ver, déjenmelo ver. Mataron al chivo y no me lo dejan.
In 1963, you have the election of Juan Bosch. He was a liberal, a social democrat who attempted to institute new social reforms. But the Bosch government didn't last for very long. Only a few months into his term in office, there was a military coup. That military coup in turn spurred a popular insurrection that led to the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965. When the rebels finally agreed to lay down their arms, the United States government scheduled new elections. But it also allowed the right-hand man of Trujillo, Joaquin Balaguer, to run in those elections for president. Balaguer won that election. The problem was that there was enormous repression against the Bosch forces, killings on an almost daily basis. So the United States then began allowing large numbers of Dominican former rebels to come to the United States as a way, again, of using migration as a safety valve. Thousands of Dominicans started coming to New York City.
Well, they said we're coming to the United States, whatever that meant. I thought we were just going up the road to some mystical place. When I finally saw a map in kindergarten of how far we had traveled, I remember being not only astonished, but literally terrified. My father was a standard kind of crazy Latino military guy who would check his children's hands and their shoes and their clothes and their hair before we left the house. I mean, we had to tie our shoes a certain way. I lived in what I call the little dictatorship, the little dictatorship of our house. When I immigrated to New Jersey, it was a very crazy time. I immigrated in 1974, a few months before the fall of Saigon. This was not a place that was very welcoming. I found myself facing a tremendous amount of racism and bigotry, but not just from like white Americans, from black Americans, and from Latinos. I think if every immigrant child in this country was allowed to tell the real emotional truth of their experience here, people in the United States would discover that we actually make immigration a more horrific experience than it needs to be. And I feel that as a country, we're in a dream where there are no mistakes, there is no evil, we are always good, we hurt no one. You know, you can't grow if you admit no mistakes.
All those hundreds and thousands that sneak into our country that could be diseased.
Illegal immigrants are attacking our culture and our way of life. They are
the most extreme elements in this country want open borders.
The process of migration transforms people so that they end up being not only strangers in the land they've come to, they also become estranged to some degree from the land they left. Migration creates this limbo itself of a new identity that is ni aquí ni allá, neither here nor there.
People of this hemisphere are entitled to a decent way of life, and to transform that principle into the reality of economic advance and social justice on which political equality must be based. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
Power sometimes is very disagreeable when you have to make very painful decisions. You see, to run a country like ours, it has to hurt you a great deal because you have to make decisions which sometimes are not agreeable.
Nicaragua, like many of the Caribbean basin countries, suffered from the same family rule. First with Anastasio Somoza and then with his two sons succeeding him. They were perhaps as brutal, if not quite at the same level as the Trujillo, but they also wanted to run the country to meet their own needs and the needs of those immediately around them.
Even Roosevelt said of Somoza, you know, he might be an SOB, but he's our SOB. I think when I went to Latin America, I was very naive. I was going down to do, you know, really good work, to talk about God. And the more I was there, the more I all of a sudden found myself going in the same circle that people are, the same, you know, you go from poverty to poverty, to more poverty. And, you know, all of a sudden you say, no, wait a second, there's something the matter with this whole system.
To understand where Nicaragua is heading, you have to know where it has come from. The young rebels who took to the streets in insurrection were battling a family that had ruled Nicaragua for almost 50 years, the Somosas, a family installed in power by the U.S. government following 20 years of occupation of Nicaragua by the U.S. Marines. Though their countrymen were desperately poor, the Somoza family amassed a huge personal fortune.
General, I've been told that your wealth is in the neighborhood of $500 million.
Well, that's what the people who adverse me say that. But I think we're around $100 million.
You own the national airline?
Yes.
You own the national shipping line?
Yes, I founded that.
Including your own port, Port Somoza?
Also, we founded that.
You own the Mercedes-Benz dealership for the country?
Yes, I got that when I was a major in the Army.
You own the leading television station?
Yes.
Radio station. You own huge financial interests in banks and insurance companies? And
yes, we could go on and on.
And then the Somozas made the fatal mistake of killing the national hero, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, this crusading journalist. After they killed Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, the banks and businesses closed their doors and went on strike. And so the economy of Nicaragua fell to a trickle.
Such was the widespread revulsion toward the Somoza family that when their regime was finally toppled in July of 1979, the victorious revolutionaries were a broad-based coalition of Nicaraguan society: the church, big business, students, city dwellers, farmers.
Peoples more numerous and more politically aware are craving and now demanding their place in the sun, not just for the benefit of their own physical condition, but for basic human rights.
Jimmy Carter, unlike many of the previous presidents and those who would come after, was more willing to accept sort of a diversity of political views around the world, including to accept the Sandinistas as the legitimate government of Nicaragua.
The wonderful thing was those first few years after the revolution, everybody was working together. It was a real time of hope, and it was a moment that nobody can take from those people. But unfortunately, their children didn't live it.
Many of those who fought alongside the Sandinistas saw their revolution betrayed. They were denied power in the new government. Some were imprisoned, others exiled. Thousands who fought with the Sandinistas have taken up arms against them and are now called the Contras. They are freedom fighters.
The Contras were mostly former National Guardsmen. They would come in and just arrest anybody who was young, take them, torture them. If they were lucky, they were let go. Mothers would say to their kids, get out of the country. I don't want you getting caught up in this. You know, that's just what the ambience was in the country at that time. And then when you had the Contra attacking, and then the government wanting to recruit the sons to go and fight the Contra, then it was really get these kids out of here.
Good evening. When President Reagan and Attorney General Edwin Meese appeared in the White House briefing room on short notice today, no one was prepared for their surprising announcements that money from the controversial Iran arms deal was secretly funneled to the Contra rebels, fighting the Sandinista government of Nicaragua.
The Iran-Contra scandal was huge and should have been much bigger. What the United States decided to do was to open up ties to Tehran by selling them surface-to-air missiles. The profits of those sales were then put into banks in Switzerland and were removed to pass to the Contras, who were trying to overthrow the Sandinistas. What Iran-Contra represented at the very heart of the problem was to ignore American law. American law clearly stated that the United States was not allowed to provide military assistance to the Contras. And American law also stated that we weren't going to do business with governments such as Iran that were involved with terrorist actions. The instability that we have contributed to creates the kind of chaos and disarray that leads to more immigration, because you can argue that if we move into these societies and contribute to this dysfunction, we have a moral obligation to help the people who feel unsafe in the situations that we in part have created.
There's a Luis Enrique Mejia Lopez from 1 year old to 15. There's another Luis Enrique Mejia Lopez from 15 on. Everything changed. Everything in what a 15-year-old supposedly should not be exposed to. But in my case, it gave me the tools to be who I am now. I lived in a city called Iriamba, and right next to the house that I lived in, there was the police station. A couple of nights, my brother and I heard people screaming so loud that you could hear it in our rooms. For me, that was a very traumatic experience.
Lo que veía desde la ventana de mi cuarto, el verano del 78, vi una nube que crecía y mi infancia que se iba.
On one side, I had some of my family that were with the government and some of my family that was not with the government. So I was caught up in the middle of this thing, trying to figure out things for myself. You can't make a kid when he's 15 years old choose a side, especially of something that he doesn't truly know what it is about. I lost a lot of my friends. And then you ask yourself, what are we dying for? What saved my brother and I is that my grandfather on my mom's side of the family decided to send us to the States. I didn't even have a clue that we were coming into this country illegally. When I started high school, that's when I found out what being illegal meant.
You know what's interesting? That myth continues.
I had the possibility to apply for a scholarship to go to Berkeley. I wanted to go to Berkeley and study music and learn. And I couldn't do it.
Crecí en las sombras del silencio, fui un ilegal con miedo, sin papeles y sin dirección. Desde los 15 años soy el extranjero, no soy de aquí ni soy de allá. Entre mi gente soy la voz que vive lejos, pero jamás voy a olvidar.
I had done some music that spoke very strongly about how I felt with the Sandinista government in my country. That helped me to get political asylum. I had all the tools I needed to make something happen for my life.
Viva donde viva, yo me siento en casa. Hoy tengo un hijo y no quisiera verlo pasar esa experiencia. Si un día no hubiera fronteras, creo que mi historia no se repitiera. Mi primera novia y mi identidad.
But once you understand that our government had a role in creating the crisis that brought these people here, then you may have a different attitude as to how we should respond to these refugees from that violence.
I had never seen anything like El Salvador. I was more frightened there than Vietnam. I've never seen such brutality of a military toward their people. The death squads were running wild. What was going on there was the slaughter of the innocents. Anyone against U.S. foreign policy or talking about land reform, they were labeled subversive, el enemigo, the enemy.
Me ataron las manos hacia atrás y me pusieron una venda muy fuerte. Yo oía gritos hasta de jóvenes y de gente quizá adulta, hombres y mujeres que lloraban y que daban gritos horribles. Me dijeron, no te vamos a hacer nada, lo que queremos es que nos des los nombres y direcciones de tus compañeros con quien trabajas. Yo siempre les dije, no conozco a nadie, no tengo ni nombres ni direcciones. Y dijeron, bueno, esta cabrona no quiere hablar. Oí yo que decían, ¿a quién le toca la primera tortura? Y alguien decía, a mí. Yo de momento pensé que era así como algo psicológico, pero no, luego me quitaron la ropa, me violó uno de ellos, me pusieron choques eléctricos en los senos y en todo mi cuerpo. Luego dijeron, no, esta cabrona como no quieres hablar y todo, pásenme la estaca. Solo me dieron vuelta el cuerpo y me metieron una estaca en el recto. Yo sentí que me morí de repente. Luego sentí que oí que dijeron, esta cabrona ya se murió. En las afueritas de San Miguel, ahí me tiraron a un lado de la carretera. Yo no sé a qué horas pude reaccionar. Sí existen los milagros, porque hubieron miles y miles de torturados que no tuvieron la suerte que yo tuve de sobrevivir.
We can talk for hours about Bishop Romero. He was special. He, like most of us, went through this conversion. He was silent, aloof. But something happened to Bishop Romero. He began to hear the cry of his people. He felt their suffering. And what he said was that, I'm a bishop, a Catholic bishop with a lot of influence and power. I must speak for my people who don't have a voice.
Every Sunday, the whole country listened to him. You could walk down the block and not miss a word he said because everybody was listening. And he would say, Guardia, basta ya. It's enough already. Stop it. Stop the killing.
The last sermon of Archbishop Oscar Romero that he gave in the cathedral the day before he was assassinated, where he made a special plea to the men in the military, saying to them, "Stop the killing. Lay down your weapons. Disobey your superior officers telling you to kill your fellow campesinos. And obey a higher law, that law that says thou shalt not kill."
Cuyos lamentos suben hasta el cielo cada día.
His assassination in church stunned the entire nation.
As the crowd started to grow, they realized that this was going to be a very difficult time. And we could see all the Guardia that were on all the roofs. All of a sudden, there was a shot fired. And then the bomb went off. Everybody just scattered. Then the Guardia opened fire. Oh, Lord. It's important that the world know that we stood behind him.
For the first time, someone had faced down the Salvadoran military and say, "You people are killing the people you are sworn to protect."
Father Paul Schindler had received a telephone call saying his firemen had seen the bodies of 4 women. Very definitely American. He began reading the description of the 4 women. And as he read each one, I could say, that was Jean, that's Jean, that's Dorothy, that's Eta. 3 of us knelt down there to pray. And I guess my prayer was, like Moore had said once before, how long, oh God, how long must this continue to happen?
Stop the repression! Look at this guy. Look at this fella. What's your position? Stop the repression in El Salvador! Our tax dollars are killing priests! Let me just say a word about El Salvador. Maybe it'll help.
Why are we killing priests in El Salvador?
The answer is we're not. Now you be quiet, and here's the answer to your question. We are
You will understand, if you read from our reporting, that it was the Salvadoran military who killed these women. I have no doubt about that.
We learned that the vast majority of those who participated in these massacres and human rights abuses were trained right down the street here at the School of the Americas. The United Nations Truth Commission report on El Salvador documented that those who killed Bishop Oscar Romero trained here at this school. Those who raped and killed the churchwomen, of the 5 responsible, 4 of them graduates. There was El Mesote, where over 800 were killed, over 100 children. Of the 12 responsible, 10 of them graduates of the School of the Americas. Few people knew about this. It was hiding behind this wall of secrecy. Many at this school became their country's dictators.
Actually, some of the worst tyrants in South American and Central American history have come through the School of Americas. And it's essentially an indoctrination tool. It's a tool for building close ties between the people we identify as future military leaders in Central America and South America and American military representatives.
When you finance and train a gang of uniformed butchers, and they begin wholesale killing, wiping out whole villages, the people don't emigrate. They flee.
El Salvador is a perfect example of how U.S. policy in Latin America affects migration. In 1980, there were only 94,000 Salvadorans in the United States. As the war escalated, tens of thousands of Salvadorans fled and came to this country. And today, the Salvadoran population of the United States is poised to become the third largest of all the Latino groups in the country.
I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally.
A lot of people forget that it was President Ronald Reagan, perhaps the most conservative president of the lifetime of most of us, who signed into law the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, a law that produced probably the biggest legalization of undocumented immigrants in United States history. Close to 3 million people ended up being able to legalize their status in the United States as a result of that law.
This is the heart and soul of Operation Gatekeeper. Right here along the Pacific Ocean, this has caused 10,000 deaths. 10,000 human beings have died because of this wall. Like Senator Kennedy told me, show me a 50-foot wall, I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. We know that the American people, like the Mexican people, like the people from all over the world, are good people. And they want to do the right thing. But they need to know what's happening in order to do the right thing.
Operation Gatekeeper was an attempt in the 1990s to have huge numbers of Border Patrol agents grouped around the main entry points, the big cities of the border. But all that did was to force the migrants to head into less populated areas of the 2,000-mile border. And so it actually resulted in more deaths in the least populated portions of the border by migrants trying to cross.
Whether I broke the law at the time when I came to the United States was the last thing that was in my mind. I think that the most important thing that I had in mind was precisely to be able to send food back to my parents. I mean, as simple as that. I grew up in a small farming community outside of Mexicali. We were poor, but we had enough money to eat. And if you work, you had at least food, and we would eat meat at least once a week. When we've had a devaluation of the Mexican peso, things began to get really, really difficult. And that's when we began to feel the hunger. My father, I remember, I am about 8 or 9 years old. I'm coming out of the house. He's in the back of the house crying. One of my uncles comes from the United States and brings us sacks of potatoes and beans and rice. Imagine the impact that this can have on an 8-year-old kid who sees his family going through the struggle of no food. I always wondered whether or not this had an impact in my life in such a way that one day I said, I am going to go into the United States and search for this opportunity.
In 1994, the United States, Canada, and Mexico passed a free trade agreement called the North American Free Trade Agreement, which allowed commerce to cross borders, but not people. The big companies became richer. So they say, oh yeah, NAFTA's been a success. Yeah, it has been a success for those rich companies. But how about for the people, especially the people on the lower end of the economic scale?
For Alvarez Correa, NAFTA has been a disaster. While the trade agreement opened U.S. markets to Mexican corn farmers, they haven't been able to sell any corn in America. Meanwhile, American farmers have flooded Mexico with cheap corn thanks to generous U.S. government subsidies. As many as 2 million farm workers have lost their jobs. The vast majority headed north across the U.S. border looking for better pay.
This is our opportunity to provide an impetus to freedom and democracy in Latin America and create new jobs for America as well. It's a good deal, and we ought to take it.
More than 80% of Mexican trade is between U.S. and Mexico. It's unhealthy, such a concentration of trade in the U.S. It's a partnership, but a very unbalanced partnership. That's why, among other things, Mexico began to export people. Lots and lots of undocumented workers going to the U.S. because it was impossible for them to remain in Mexico.
My whole objective is to try to pay back. How do I do that? Through example, by doing science, by trying to be the best brain surgeon that I can possibly be. So one day, I can find a better way to treat brain cancer. The same hands that used to pick tomatoes are the same hands that now are privileged to touch that organ, that beautiful organ. We're all humans. We all have the same abilities. We all have the same potential. The question is, how do you take advantage of that potential?
These are 700 bricks with 700 people buried underneath them with 700 stories. Not one of them expected to die when they were crossing the border. It's the biggest mass grave site in the United States that's not a military grave site. Parents think that they made it. Did they remarry again? Are they still alive? And I cannot imagine the horror, what it was like for them to be crossing in the desert, dying of thirst. They expected to find the American dream and to cross the border and find work, just like immigrants have been doing for hundreds of years coming into this country. For this group, they ended up at this cemetery in Holtville, Imperial County, California.
It's not just what happens to the Latino community and to the Latino individuals and these families that are being ripped apart. It's what does it say about us as an American society? What does it say about us as a society that we have institutions that will go and separate families, American-born children from their parents, in a society that says that we're about family values? What does it say about a so-called free society that you can get a knock on the door, and if it's tied to immigration, they do not need a warrant to come into your home? There is no such thing as an illegal human being, as an illegal immigrant, as an illegal alien. To call people illegal is the beginning of dehumanizing.
Nobody likes to leave their home. No one relishes the idea of abandoning their family or their children or their loved ones for years at a time. They only do it out of desperation. They only do it because they can no longer live in the conditions that they're facing in their own country. Well, the harvest of the empire is that all the peoples of the former colonial nations are coming to the metropolis. They're coming to the very countries that used to dominate them. The reality is that those advanced countries need their labor, because all the countries that fought in World War II and produced huge baby boomer generations are now growing old, and they're going to need somebody to work in their countries to maintain that baby boomer population. And those workers will inevitably come from Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
I believe that people, in fact, are born with something called the American spirit. And you may be born with that American spirit, whether you're born in Mexico or in Peru or in Thailand or wherever. And it's this vision, this idea that if you really work hard enough, there's a country out there where there's a level playing field and you can make it. And that's what I think motivates people, this American spirit that they're born with. And that's why what I tell my children is that they have a responsibility to speak out. They have to speak up for what it really is to be an American, what it really is to be an immigrant in this country, what it really is to be a Latino. It's got to be our young people who understand that they can't be silent. It's on their shoulders.
All nations invest in their young people, and that investment never gets paid back until the young people finish school and become productive members of the society. So whether it is an immigrant child or an American child, the investment is in the future. America has always been a nation in the process of becoming, in process of change. That's one of the hallmarks of American history, the constant change of the population. It is an immigrant nation.